When I woke up that Tuesday morning, I had no idea my entire world was about to shift on its axis. At 73 years old, you'd think I'd be prepared for life's surprises, but nothing could have prepared me for what my own family was about to put me through. My name is Dorothy, and I've spent the last 5 decades building a life that most people would consider comfortable. But comfortable, as I was about to learn, means nothing when the people closest to you see you as nothing more than a burden. The day started like any other. I made my morning coffee in the small apartment I'd been living in for the past 2 years. Ever since my husband Charles passed away, the rent was manageable on my pension, and I'd grown fond of the quiet neighborhood. My daughter-in-law Jessica had suggested this place after Charles died, claiming it would be perfect for someone in my situation. Someone in my situation. Those words should have been my first warning sign, but grief has a way of making you miss the obvious red flags. Jessica had been married to my son Marcus for 8 years, and in all that time, I'd tried my best to welcome her into our family. She was different from what I'd imagined for Marcus. But love doesn't always follow the script we write in our heads. Jessica came from what she liked to call old money, though I'd never seen much evidence of this wealth in their modest 2-bedroom house, or Marcus's used Honda still. She carried herself with an air of superiority that made every family gathering feel like a performance, where I was always playing the wrong part. The phone rang around noon, jolting me from my afternoon reading. It was Marcus, and his voice carried that strained quality it had developed whenever he called these days. We used to talk every few days, easy conversations about work, the weather, memories of his father. But ever since Jessica had gotten more involved in planning family events, our calls had become stilted, formal, like he was reading from a script she'd written for him. Marcus told me they wanted to take me out for dinner that evening. A nice family meal, he said, somewhere special to celebrate. When I asked what we were celebrating, he got vague, mentioning something about good news. In family time, Jessica had picked the restaurant, he explained, somewhere she'd been wanting to try. I should dress nicely, he added, because it was an upscale place. The way he said it made my stomach turn slightly. There was something in his tone, a carefulness that suggested this dinner was more than just a family meal. But I pushed those feelings aside. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe Jessica was finally making an effort to include me more in their lives. Maybe this was her way of extending an olive branch after years of polite but distant interactions. I spent the afternoon choosing what to wear. My wardrobe wasn't extensive these days, but I had a few nice pieces left from when Charles and I used to go out regularly. I settled on a navy blue dress that had always been one of Charles's favorites, paired with the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, I felt presentable, maybe even elegant. I reminded myself that Jessica came from money, so she'd know how to choose a restaurant that appreciated a certain level of class. Marcus picked me up at 6, and Jessica was already in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone with that bored expression she wore whenever she had to spend time with me. She looked up long enough to give me a once-over, her eyes lingering on my dress and jewelry with an expression I couldn't quite read. Her own outfit was clearly expensive, all sharp lines and designer labels that she wore like armor. The drive to the restaurant was filled with Jessica's commentary about the neighborhood we were passing through. She pointed out houses and businesses with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd never had to worry about money. Marcus nodded along, but I could see his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with each of her observations. When we passed a small diner that Charles and I used to love, Jessica wrinkled her nose and made a comment about how some people have such low standards. I bit my tongue, remembering all the wonderful meals Charles and I had shared in places exactly like that diner. We'd built our life on simple pleasures and genuine connections, not on impressing others with expensive taste. But I was determined to make this evening work, to find some common ground with the woman my son had chosen to build his life with. The restaurant Jessica had chosen was in the most exclusive part of town, the kind of place where valet parking wasn't optional, and the hostess looked you up and down before deciding whether you belonged there. The building itself was imposing, all dark wood and brass fixtures, with the kind of understated elegance that screamed money rather than shouting it. I'd heard of this place before, seen it mentioned in the society pages of the local newspaper, but I'd never imagined I'd actually set foot inside. As we walked toward the entrance, Jessica's demeanor shifted. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, transforming into what I could only describe as her public persona. The woman who'd spent the car ride making snide comments about other people's choices suddenly became gracious and refined, greeting the doorman with the familiarity of someone who belonged in this world. Marcus held the door for me, and I could feel his nervousness radiating off him like heat. Whatever this dinner was really about, he was dreading it as much as I was beginning to. The hostess approached us with a professional smile, and Jessica stepped forward to give our reservation name. That's when I noticed the slight change in Jessica's expression, a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty. We were seated at a table near the back of the restaurant, and I couldn't help but notice how Jessica kept glancing around, as if she was looking for someone or checking to see who else was dining there. Marcus was unusually quiet, studying his menu with an intensity that seemed forced. The prices were astronomical, the kind of numbers that made my pension look like pocket change, and I found myself wondering how we were going to split the bill. The waiter who approached our table was young and professionally courteous, going through the evening specials with practiced ease. Jessica ordered wine without consulting either Marcus or me, choosing something from a price range that made me wince internally. When the waiter left to get our drinks, an uncomfortable silence settled over our table. That's when Jessica finally revealed the real reason for this dinner. She and Marcus had been talking, she said, about my living situation. They were concerned about me living alone at my age, worried about my safety and my finances. She painted a picture of loving concern, but her words felt calculated, rehearsed. They'd been researching options, she continued, places where I could get the care and support I needed. The way she said care and support made my blood run cold. I realized this wasn't a celebration dinner at all. This was an intervention, an ambush disguised as family time. Jessica had chosen this expensive restaurant not to treat me, but to make a point. She wanted me to feel out of place, overwhelmed by the cost and the atmosphere. She wanted me to understand that I didn't belong in their world, that I was a burden they needed to manage. Marcus finally spoke up, but his words offered no comfort. He talked about assisted living facilities and the benefits of having medical staff nearby. He mentioned selling my apartment and using the proceeds to help cover the costs. Every word felt like another nail in the coffin of my independence, another step toward becoming the helpless old woman they apparently saw me as. I sat there, listening to them plan my future, without really asking for my input, feeling smaller with each passing minute. The restaurant around us buzzed with conversation and laughter, but our table felt like an island of tension, In the middle of all that elegance, Jessica's mask of concern was slipping slightly, revealing glimpses of the impatience and irritation she usually tried to hide when dealing with me. The irony wasn't lost on me that they'd chosen this particular setting for this conversation. Here I was, surrounded by luxury I supposedly couldn't afford, being told that I needed to give up my independence and move into what amounted to an expensive holding pen for elderly people whose families had grown tired of dealing with them. But what they didn't know, what Jessica in particular had no idea about, was that appearances can be deceiving. They'd made assumptions about my financial situation based on my modest apartment and simple lifestyle. They'd assumed that because I didn't flaunt wealth the way Jessica did, I didn't have any. They'd mistaken my choice to live quietly for an inability to live any other way. As Jessica continued her rehearsed speech about what was best for everyone involved, I found myself remembering all the times Charles and I had discussed our financial planning. We'd been careful, methodical, building security for exactly this kind of situation. We'd made investments, maintained accounts, prepared for the future in ways that didn't require flashy displays or constant bragging about our portfolio. The waiter returned with our wine, and Jessica made a show of tasting it and approving the selection. She was performing for the staff, demonstrating her sophistication and her right to be in this establishment. But with each theatrical gesture, she was revealing more about her own insecurities than she realized. Marcus was fidgeting with his napkin, avoiding my eyes as Jessica painted her vision of my future. She spoke about activities coordinators and meal plans, about how much easier it would be for everyone if I just accepted that this was the natural progression of things. Her voice had that practiced sweetness that people use when they're delivering bad news. They've convinced themselves is actually good news. I watched her performance with growing clarity about what was really happening here. This wasn't about my well-being at all. This was about convenience, about removing an inconvenience from their lives so they could move forward without the burden of checking on an elderly mother-in-law. The expensive restaurant setting wasn't an accident either. Jessica had chosen this place specifically to make me feel small, to emphasize the gap between their world and mine. The appetizers arrived, tiny portions arranged artistically on oversized plates. Jessica made appreciative noises about the presentation, while Marcus pushed food around with his fork, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. I found myself thinking about all the hearty meals Charles and I had shared over the years, food that filled you up and warmed your soul, rather than just looking pretty on expensive china. As Jessica continued outlining their plans for my future, she mentioned that they'd already visited several facilities. They'd done research, she said, compared amenities and costs. The way she talked about it made it sound like they were shopping for a car rather than planning to uproot my entire life. She had brochures in her purse, she announced triumphantly, pulling out glossy pamphlets filled with smiling elderly people engaged in craft activities and group exercises. The images in those brochures told a story I didn't want to be part of. Scheduled meal times, organized entertainment, supervised outings to the mall. It was a life designed for people who'd given up on making their own choices, who were content to have every hour of every day planned by someone else. The smiling faces in the photographs looked hollow to me, like people who'd accepted defeat and were trying to make the best of it. Marcus finally found his voice again, explaining how they'd narrowed it down to 3 facilities that were within their budget range. Their budget range. Not mine, I noticed. They'd already decided how much of my money they were willing to spend on warehousing me somewhere out of their way. The presumption was breathtaking, but I could see they genuinely believed they were being generous and thoughtful. Jessica leaned forward conspiratorially, lowering her voice as if she was about to share something particularly intimate. She told me about the social worker she'd spoken to, how the woman had explained that many elderly people resist these transitions because they're frightened of change. It was completely normal, Jessica assured me, this reluctance to accept help. But at my age, she continued, it was important to be realistic about my limitations. My limitations. The phrase hung in the air between us like a challenge. Jessica had no idea what my limitations actually were, because she'd never bothered to really know me. She'd spent 8 years treating me like a piece of furniture that came with Marcus, something to be tolerated rather than valued. Now she was making life-altering decisions based on assumptions and stereotypes about what it meant to be a widow in her 70s. The main course arrived, and I had to admit the food was exceptional. The chef clearly understood how to balance flavors and textures in ways that elevated simple ingredients into something memorable. But the excellence of the meal only made the conversation more surreal. Here we were, enjoying a $100 dinner, while they calmly dismantled my independence course by course. Jessica was warming to her subject now, describing the activities program at her preferred facility with the enthusiasm of someone selling vacation packages. There were book clubs, she said, and chair yoga classes, movie nights and bingo games. She made it sound like summer camp for senior citizens, all fun and games and structured socialization. What she didn't mention was the loss of privacy, the institutional rules, the slow erosion of dignity that came with being managed rather than living. I thought about my small apartment, with its familiar corners and personal touches, my books arranged exactly how I liked them, my morning routine of coffee and newspaper reading, my freedom to come and go as I pleased. These weren't luxuries. They were the basic components of an independent life. But Jessica was talking about them as if they were dangerous indulgences I could no longer afford. Marcus tried to soften the blow by talking about visiting schedules and how close the facility was to their house. He promised regular family dinners and holiday celebrations, painting a picture of continued connection that we all knew was unlikely to materialize. Once I was safely tucked away in institutional care, the visits would become less frequent, the phone calls more perfunctory. I'd seen it happen to other women my age. The gradual abandonment disguised as busy schedules and important obligations. The waiter appeared again, asking if we wanted dessert, and Jessica made a show of consulting with Marcus about whether they had room for something sweet. Neither of them asked what I might want, treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted to make decisions about her own meal. It was a small thing, but it perfectly encapsulated their attitude toward my entire life. As Jessica described the dessert menu to Marcus, going into detail about the chocolate souffle and the seasonal fruit tart, I found myself remembering a conversation I'd had with Charles just months before he died. We'd been reviewing our financial statements, making sure everything was in order for whatever the future might bring. Charles had been proud of how well our investments had performed over the years, how our careful planning had created a security net that would allow me to live comfortably for the rest of my life. We'd talked about different scenarios, different possibilities for how my later years might unfold. Charles had made me promise that I wouldn't let anyone pressure me into giving up my independence prematurely. He'd seen too many of his friends shuffled into care facilities by well-meaning children who were more interested in peace of mind than their parents' actual well-being. Jessica was still talking about dessert options, but her voice seemed to be coming from far away. I was thinking about the safety deposit box at First National Bank, about the investment portfolios Charles had meticulously maintained, about the insurance policies and retirement accounts that Jessica had no knowledge of. My modest lifestyle had been a choice, not a necessity, but they'd interpreted it as evidence of financial struggle. The assumption was understandable, I supposed. Most people my age were living on fixed incomes, stretching Social Security checks to cover basic expenses. Most widows did face financial challenges after losing a spouse's income. But Charles and I had planned better than most, had made sacrifices earlier in our lives to ensure security later on. The irony was that Jessica's own financial situation was probably more precarious than mine. Despite all her posturing about good breeding and expensive taste, Marcus was nodding along as Jessica explained why the Sunset Manor facility was the best choice among their 3 options. It had the newest equipment, she said, and the most experienced staff. The monthly fees were higher than the other places, but she felt it was worth the extra expense for quality care. Again, she was talking about my money as if it were theirs to spend, making decisions about my future comfort level based on what they thought I could afford. The dessert arrived, an elaborate construction of chocolate and cream that looked more like architecture than food. Jessica photographed it with her phone before taking a bite, presumably to share with her social media followers. Later, everything was performance with her. Every experience filtered through the lens of how it would look to others. Even this conversation about my future was partly about her image as a caring daughter-in-law who took responsibility for family obligations. As we shared the dessert, Jessica began talking about timeline. They'd already put a deposit down on a room at Sunset Manor, she announced casually, as if this were a minor detail rather than a major violation of my autonomy. The room would be available in 6 weeks, which would give me time to sort through my belongings and decide what to keep. Most of my furniture wouldn't be needed, she explained, since the facility provided all the basics. 6 weeks. They'd given me 6 weeks to dismantle a lifetime of memories and possessions, to surrender my independence and accept the role of managed elderly person. The presumption was staggering, but what struck me most was how certain they were that I would simply go along with their plan. They'd never considered the possibility that I might refuse, might have other ideas about how I wanted to spend my remaining years. The check arrived, and Jessica made a great show of examining it before handing it to Marcus. She commented on the total as if the amount proved some point about the restaurant's quality, about their sophistication in choosing such an establishment. Marcus looked uncomfortable as he pulled out his credit card, and I realized they were probably stretching their budget to afford this meal. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so sad. As we waited for Marcus to handle the payment, Jessica launched into what sounded like a prepared closing argument. She talked about peace of mind and professional care, about the importance of being realistic about aging and accepting help when it was offered. Her tone was patient, but firm, the way you might speak to a stubborn child who needed to be convinced to take medicine. But I wasn't a child, and I wasn't the helpless widow they'd convinced themselves I was. As Jessica continued her speech about what was best for everyone involved, I felt something shifting inside me. The hurt and shock were crystallizing into something harder, something more determined. They'd made a fundamental mistake in their calculations, and they were about to discover just how wrong they'd been about Dorothy Johnson. The valet brought Marcus's car around, and we made our way out of the restaurant into the cool evening air. Jessica was still talking about next steps and practical considerations, about the paperwork we'd need to complete and the appointments we'd need to schedule. She had it all figured out, every detail planned except for one crucial element. She'd never asked what I wanted. As we drove back to my apartment in silence, Jessica's voice still echoing in my head, with all her talk about timelines and deposits, I couldn't help but think about how we'd arrived at this moment. It hadn't happened overnight. The signs had been building for months, maybe even years, but I'd been too polite, too willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. It started small, the way these things always do. Comments about my grocery choices when they'd visit, suggestions that I was buying too much food for one person. Jessica would open my refrigerator and make little clicking sounds with her tongue, shaking her head at the fresh vegetables and good cuts of meat I treated myself to. She'd hold up a package of salmon or a nice piece of beef and ask if I really needed to be spending money on such expensive items at my age. Then came the observations about my apartment. Nothing directly critical at first, just pointed questions about whether I really needed so much space for one person. Did I use the guest bedroom? Was the living room too big to keep clean properly? Wouldn't something smaller be more manageable? Each question was wrapped in apparent concern, but I could hear the underlying message: you're taking up too much space, using too many resources, living beyond what someone like you deserves. The financial questions started about 6 months ago. Jessica would ask about my monthly expenses with the kind of casual interest that wasn't casual at all. How much was my rent, my utilities, my grocery bill? She'd shake her head sympathetically when I answered, making comments about how hard it must be to manage on a fixed income. She never asked about my assets, my investments, my savings. She simply assumed that my modest lifestyle reflected modest means. Marcus went along with it all, nodding when Jessica made her observations, agreeing when she expressed her concerns. I watched my son transform from the independent man his father and I had raised into someone who seemed afraid to disagree with his wife about anything. It broke my heart to see him diminish himself that way, to watch him become a supporting player in his own life. The turning point came 3 weeks ago when Jessica announced she'd been doing research. She'd spoken to a social worker, she said, someone who specialized in elder care transitions. This woman had explained how important it was for families to be proactive about these situations, to start planning before a crisis. Force their hand, Jessica used phrases like best practices and professional recommendations, making it sound like moving me into institutional care was the responsible, educated choice. She'd brought brochures that day, spreading them across my kitchen table like a real estate agent showing property listings. Each facility had its own selling points, its own combination of amenities and price points. Jessica went through them methodically, comparing memory care units and medication management programs as if she were shopping for a vacation resort. She made notes in the margins, circling features she thought were important, completely ignoring my growing discomfort with the entire conversation. Marcus sat beside her, occasionally nodding or making noncommittal sounds of agreement. When I tried to interject, to say that I wasn't ready for this kind of conversation, Jessica would smile patiently and explain why it was better to plan ahead. Waiting until there was a problem, she said, only made things more difficult for everyone involved. Better to make these decisions while I was still thinking clearly. The phrase, still thinking clearly, hit me like a slap. It implied that my current mental state was temporary, that decline was inevitable and imminent, Jessica delivered it with such casual certainty, as if my cognitive deterioration was already underway, and we were just managing the logistics of my inevitable incompetence. That night, after they left, I sat in my kitchen, staring at those brochures. The smiling faces looked back at me from glossy pages, elderly people engaged in supervised activities, living lives carefully managed by others, art therapy sessions and group exercise classes, medication reminders and meal planning. It was a life without spontaneity, without privacy, without the simple dignity of making your own choices about how to spend your time. I thought about Charles and how angry he would have been to see those brochures on our table. He'd always been fiercely protective of our independence, proud of the life we'd built together through hard work and careful planning. We'd talked about aging, about the possibility that one of us might need care eventually. But we'd never imagined our own child would be so eager to warehouse the surviving parent. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my financial advisor, Margaret Chen, a sharp woman in her 50s, who'd been managing my investments since Charles passed away. Margaret had been recommended by the bank, and she'd proven to be both knowledgeable and trustworthy. More importantly, she treated me like an intelligent adult, capable of understanding my own financial situation. Margaret's office was in a modest building downtown, nothing like the flashy establishments that catered to the truly wealthy. But her expertise was undeniable. When I explained what Jessica and Marcus were planning, Margaret's expression grew concerned. Not about my mental capacity or my ability to live independently, but about the presumption they were showing in making decisions about my assets. She pulled out my portfolio, spreading the documents across her desk with the same methodical care Jessica had shown with her brochures. But these papers told a very different story than the one my family had constructed conservative investments that had performed well over the years, retirement accounts that had grown steadily, life insurance policies that had matured into substantial cash values. The numbers painted a picture of financial security that went far beyond what my simple lifestyle suggested. Margaret walked me through everything, making sure I understood not just the current values, but the projected income these assets could generate for decades to come. With proper management, she explained, I could maintain my current lifestyle indefinitely, with enough left over to handle any medical emergencies or long-term care needs that might arise. I wasn't the struggling widow Jessica had imagined. I was a woman with options, with resources, with the financial foundation to make my own choices about my future. The conversation with Margaret clarified something that had been nagging at me for weeks. Jessica's urgency about moving me into care wasn't based on any real assessment of my needs or capabilities. It was based on her desire to solve what she saw as the problem of me, an elderly mother-in-law who required attention and consideration, who complicated their social plans and reminded them of responsibilities they'd rather not think about. But there was something else, something I'd been reluctant to acknowledge, even to myself. Jessica's interest in my living situation had intensified around the same time Marcus had been passed over for a promotion at work. They'd been counting on that advancement, on the salary increase it would have brought. Without it, they were struggling more than they'd admitted, stretching to maintain the lifestyle Jessica felt she deserved. My apartment, small as it was, represented equity they could access if I were no longer living there. The monthly rent I paid could be redirected toward their own expenses if I were paying institutional fees. Instead, they'd never said any of this directly, but the timeline of their concern was too convenient to ignore. Their financial pressure had coincided perfectly with their sudden worry about my well-being. The realization stung more than I'd expected. I'd always known Jessica married Marcus, partly for security, for the stability of a family that seemed more established than her own chaotic background. But I'd hoped that over the years, she'd developed some genuine affection for me, some real concern for my happiness. Instead, it seemed I'd become nothing more than a financial calculation, an asset to be managed for maximum convenience. That evening, I walked through my apartment with new eyes. Every room, every piece of furniture, every small comfort I'd created for myself represented something Jessica wanted to eliminate, not because these things were harmful to me, but because they were inconvenient to her vision of how our family should be structured. The kitchen where I prepared meals I actually enjoyed, choosing ingredients based on what appealed to me, rather than what someone else thought appropriate for my age. The living room, where I could read in my favorite chair, positioned exactly where the light was best in the afternoon. The bedroom, where I could sleep according to my own schedule, waking when my body was ready, rather than when institutional routine demanded. These weren't luxuries or indulgences. They were the basic elements of autonomous adult life. But Jessica had decided they were unnecessarily complicated, that I would be better served by having these choices made for me by trained professionals who knew what was best for people my age. I thought about the women I'd known who'd made similar transitions, who'd been convinced by their children that institutional care was the sensible choice. I'd visited some of them over the years, watched them adapt to lives that were safer and more supervised, but somehow smaller than what they'd had before. They'd learned to be grateful for group activities and scheduled outings, to appreciate the convenience of having meals prepared and medications managed by others. But I'd also seen the spark go out of their eyes, the way they'd stopped talking about plans and started talking about routines. They'd become grateful patients rather than independent women, trading autonomy for security in a bargain that benefited their families more than themselves. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Marcus calling to follow up on dinner, to make sure I understood everything they'd discussed. His voice had that careful, measured tone he'd developed when delivering news he knew I wouldn't want to hear. He wanted to schedule a visit to Sunset Manor, he said, so I could see the facility for myself and meet with the admissions coordinator. I listened to him talk about visiting hours and application deadlines, about the deposit they'd already made, and the paperwork that needed to be completed. He'd clearly rehearsed this conversation, probably with Jessica coaching him on how to handle my potential objections. Every concern I might raise had been anticipated, every argument countered with reasonable-sounding responses. But as he talked, I found myself thinking about Margaret's office, about the portfolio documents spread across her desk, about the options and resources I had that Marcus and Jessica knew nothing about. They'd built their entire plan on assumptions about my limitations, my dependence, my gratitude for their intervention in my life. They were about to discover just how wrong those assumptions were. The next morning brought another call, this time from Jessica directly. Her voice was bright with artificial enthusiasm as she told me about the appointment she'd scheduled at Sunset Manor she'd arranged for a tour and consultation that afternoon. She said, taking advantage of a last-minute opening in their schedule. It would be perfect timing, she explained, because we could get the process started right away. The presumption was breathtaking. She'd made appointments and commitments on my behalf without asking, assuming I would simply show up and participate in planning my own displacement. But her excitement was palpable as she described the facility's amenities, the professional staff, the peace of mind it would give everyone to know I was being properly cared for. I agreed to the appointment, which seemed to surprise her. She'd clearly been prepared for resistance, for arguments and emotional appeals about wanting to stay in my own home. Instead, I was calm and cooperative, asking practical questions about timing and what I should bring to the consultation. My unexpected compliance seemed to energize her, confirming her belief that I was finally being reasonable about my situation. As I prepared for the visit to Sunset Manor, I thought about performance and perception, about the careful balance between appearing compliant and maintaining my own agenda. Jessica had chosen that expensive restaurant the night before to make a point about my place in their world. Now it was my turn to choose the setting for the next act of this drama. I dressed carefully for the appointment, selecting clothes that would reinforce their assumptions about my financial situation while maintaining my own dignity. Nothing too expensive or flashy. Nothing that would contradict the narrative of modest means they'd constructed around my life. I was playing a part now, and like any good actress, I needed to understand my character's motivations. The drive to Sunset Manor gave me time to observe Marcus and Jessica together, to see how they'd divided the roles in this family intervention. Jessica did most of the talking, explaining the facility's features and benefits with the enthusiasm of someone who'd already made up her mind. Marcus nodded along, occasionally adding supportive comments, but I could see he was uncomfortable with the whole situation. Part of him knew this was wrong, knew they were pushing too hard and too fast. But he'd learned to defer to Jessica's judgment on family matters, to trust her social instincts over his own emotional responses. It was easier to go along with her plan than to confront the possibility that they were making a terrible mistake. The facility itself was impressive in the way these places always are, all gleaming surfaces and cheerful colors designed to mask the fundamental reality of institutional living. The admissions coordinator, a woman named Patricia, who'd clearly perfected the art of selling security to worried families, greeted us with professional warmth and guided us through the tour with practiced efficiency. Patricia knew her audience. She directed most of her comments to Jessica and Marcus, speaking about me in the third person, as if I weren't capable of understanding the conversation myself. She explained the daily schedule, the medication management system, the emergency response procedures that would ensure my safety around the clock. As we walked through the common areas and visited a model room, I watched Jessica's face light up with satisfaction. This was exactly what she'd envisioned, a clean and organized solution to the problem of my continued independence. The monthly fees were substantial, but Patricia assured us they covered everything from meals to activities to medical monitoring. It was comprehensive care, she said, designed to give families peace of mind. When Patricia asked about my financial situation, Jessica answered before I could speak. She explained that we were working with a limited budget, that we needed to be realistic about what I could afford on my pension and Social Security. Patricia nodded understandingly, pulling out brochures for their basic care package, the no-frills option for residents with modest means. I sat quietly through this discussion of my supposed financial limitations, watching Jessica negotiate the terms of my future confinement with the confidence of someone who believed she was acting in my best interests. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he didn't contradict his wife's assessment of my resources. The tour concluded with Patricia's office, where she spread out application forms and financial disclosure documents. The process was more complicated than I'd expected, requiring detailed information about income, assets, and medical history. Patricia explained that they needed to verify my ability to pay the monthly fees, to ensure I wouldn't become a financial burden to the facility down the line. Jessica had come prepared with some of my basic information, but she didn't have access to my complete financial picture. She fumbled through explanations about pension amounts and estimated Social Security benefits, clearly making up numbers she thought sounded reasonable. Patricia took notes, but I could see she was skeptical about some of the figures. When Patricia asked about additional assets, investments, or savings accounts, Jessica waved the question away dismissively. She explained that I was a simple woman with simple needs, that we weren't dealing with complex financial arrangements. Patricia's expression grew more concerned as she realized the application might not meet their minimum financial requirements. That's when I finally spoke up. I told Patricia that I'd prefer to handle the financial disclosure myself, that I had documents at home that would provide a more accurate picture of my situation. Jessica looked surprised, but pleased, interpreting my willingness to take responsibility as another sign that I was accepting the inevitability of this transition. We left Sunset Manor with application packets and a promise to return the completed paperwork within the week. Jessica was practically glowing with accomplishment, already making plans for how to handle the logistics of moving me out of my apartment. She talked about donation centers and storage units, about which of my possessions might be worth keeping and which could be discarded. But as we drove back toward my apartment, I was thinking about those financial disclosure forms, about the surprise that awaited anyone who took the time to really examine my resources. Jessica had built her entire plan on the foundation of my supposed poverty, my dependence on their generosity and guidance. She was about to learn that foundations built on false assumptions tend to crumble when the truth finally comes to light. That evening, alone in my apartment with the Sunset Manor application spread across my kitchen table, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of filling out the forms with the limited information Jessica expected, I was going to provide complete and accurate financial disclosure. Every account, every investment, every asset that Charles and I had carefully accumulated over decades of planning and sacrifice. Tomorrow morning, I would call Margaret Chen and ask her to prepare a comprehensive financial statement, the kind of document that would tell the real story of Dorothy Johnson's situation. Then I would return to Sunset Manor, not as the helpless widow Jessica had portrayed, but as a woman with options, resources, and the power to make her own choices about her future. The game was about to change, and Jessica had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The application forms from Sunset Manor sat exactly where I'd left them on my kitchen table, but they looked different now. Instead of documents of surrender, they'd become instruments of revelation. I made my coffee with deliberate slowness, savoring the ritual of choosing my own morning routine, knowing that Jessica viewed even this simple pleasure as evidence of my need for supervision. Margaret Chen arrived at my apartment at 10 o'clock sharp, carrying a leather briefcase that contained the complete picture of my financial life. She'd spent the early morning hours preparing what she called a comprehensive asset portfolio, the kind of document that would leave no room for misinterpretation or wishful thinking. As she spread the papers across my dining table, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Yesterday, this same table had held brochures for institutional care today. It displayed evidence of my complete financial independence. The numbers were even more impressive than I'd remembered. Conservative investments had continued growing steadily, Life insurance policies had matured into substantial cash reserves, and the pension fund Charles had contributed to for 37 years had accumulated into something quite remarkable. Margaret walked me through each category with professional precision, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She'd always been proud of how well my portfolio had performed, how the careful strategy we'd developed had exceeded even her most optimistic projections. What struck me most was the monthly income these assets generated. Even being conservative with withdrawal rates, even accounting for inflation and unexpected expenses, the numbers dwarfed what Jessica assumed I was living on. The modest lifestyle I'd chosen wasn't born of necessity, but of preference, of values that prioritized experiences over possessions, relationships over status symbols. Margaret helped me fill out the Sunset Manor financial disclosure forms with complete accuracy. Every account number, every asset value, every source of income was documented with the kind of precision that would make Patricia's eyes widen with surprise. This wasn't the application of a struggling widow dependent on her family's charity. This was the financial profile of a woman with choices, with resources that could support any lifestyle she chose to pursue. As Margaret packed up her papers, she asked the question I'd been expecting. Why was I considering institutional care when I clearly didn't need it? I explained the situation with Jessica and Marcus, the assumptions they'd made, the pressure they'd been applying. Margaret listened with the kind of professional attention that made me feel heard, understood, validated in ways my own family hadn't managed in months. Her advice was simple but powerful. Don't let other people's limitations become your limitations. Don't let their fears about aging dictate your choices about living. And most importantly, don't let them manage your assets when they don't even understand what those assets are. She left me with a promise to be available whenever I needed support, professional or personal, as I navigated whatever came next. That afternoon, I drove to Sunset Manor alone, carrying the completed application in a manila envelope that felt heavier than it should have. Jessica had called twice that morning, offering to accompany me, but I'd politely declined. This was something I needed to handle myself, I'd told her, part of taking responsibility for my own future. She'd seemed pleased by what she interpreted as acceptance, cooperation in the process she'd set in motion. Patricia was waiting for me in her office, the same professional smile in place, the same practiced warmth that had characterized our previous meeting. But when I handed her the completed financial disclosure forms, when she began reviewing the numbers with increasing amazement, the entire atmosphere of our conversation shifted. This wasn't the modest pension recipient Jessica had described. This was a woman with substantial assets, someone who could afford their premium care packages without breaking a sweat. The questions Patricia asked were different this time. Instead of discussing basic care options and payment plans, she was showing me brochures for their luxury suites, their concierge services, their premium dining options. The transformation was remarkable and somewhat depressing. Suddenly, I was worthy of respect, of attention, of the kind of care they reserved for residents whose families could afford to be demanding. But what interested me most was Patricia's confusion about the discrepancy between my actual financial situation and what my family had told her. She asked delicately about the miscommunication, clearly trying to understand how such a significant error had occurred. I explained simply that my daughter-in-law had made assumptions without consulting me directly, that she'd been working with incomplete information. Patricia nodded understandingly, but I could see her making mental notes about family dynamics, about the importance of dealing directly with potential residents rather than relying on relatives' assessments. She'd seen this before. Families who thought they understood their elderly members' situations but had never bothered to ask the right questions or examine the actual facts. I left Sunset Manor with a very different packet of materials than I'd expected. Instead of basic care brochures and payment plan options, I carried information about their most exclusive accommodations, their specialized services, their premium amenities. Patricia had even mentioned their waiting list for luxury suites, suggesting that someone with my resources might want to consider making a reservation, even if I wasn't ready to move immediately. The drive home gave me time to process what had just happened, to understand the full implications of revealing my true financial situation. Jessica's entire plan had been built on the assumption that I needed their help, that I was dependent on their guidance and support. But the woman who just left Sunset Manor wasn't dependent on anyone. She was a client, a customer, someone whose business was valuable enough to warrant special attention and consideration. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Charles died. I made dinner reservations at Chez Laurent, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, the kind of place where meals cost more than most people spent on groceries. In a week, I wanted to remember what it felt like to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what others thought I should want, to experience the luxury that my careful financial planning had made possible. The maitre d' at Chez Laurent recognized me immediately, which surprised me until I remembered that Charles and I had been regular customers there for years before his illness. We'd celebrated anniversaries and special occasions at their corner table, the one with the best view of the city lights. Mr. Beaumont, the owner, came over personally to welcome me back, expressing condolences for Charles's passing and genuine pleasure at seeing me again as I sat at that familiar table, ordering wine that cost more than Jessica probably spent on groceries in a week. I thought about the performance I'd been giving for months, the modest widow, grateful for her family's attention, accepting their guidance about her limitations and needs. But that woman had been as much of a character as the roles Jessica played in public, a mask I'd worn to keep peace, rather than an authentic representation of who I really was. The meal was exceptional, each course prepared with the kind of attention to detail that justified the restaurant's reputation and prices. But more than the food, I savored the autonomy of the experience, choosing what to eat, when to eat it, how long to linger over coffee and dessert. These weren't luxuries I'd forgotten I could afford. They were freedoms I'd surrendered in the name of family harmony, choices I'd stopped making because others had convinced me they were inappropriate for someone in my situation. Mr. Beaumont stopped by my table again as I was finishing dessert, asking about my plans, whether I'd be resuming my regular visits. His question made me realize how much I'd withdrawn from life over the past 2 years, how I'd let grief and other people's expectations shrink my world down to the bare minimum. But grief didn't have to mean the end of joy, and age didn't have to mean the end of choice. I told him I'd be coming back regularly, that I was ready to start living again, rather than just surviving. His smile was genuine, the kind of response you get when people see you reclaiming something important that you'd lost. As I left the restaurant, I felt more like myself than I had in months, more connected to the woman Charles had fallen in love with than the character I'd been playing for Jessica's benefit. The next morning brought a call from Marcus, asking about my visit to Sunset Manor, wanting to know how the application process had gone. His voice carried that careful tone he'd developed when discussing what they'd decided was best for me. The patronizing patience of someone who'd already made up his mind about the outcome. I told him the application had been submitted, that Patricia would be reviewing it and getting back to us soon. What I didn't mention was Patricia's surprise at my financial disclosure, her immediate shift from basic care coordinator to luxury services consultant. I didn't explain how the conversation had changed once she realized she was dealing with a woman who had options, rather than a dependent widow with limited resources. That information would come later, when the timing was right, when it could have maximum impact. Jessica called an hour later, her voice bright, with the satisfaction of someone whose plans were proceeding smoothly. She'd already started researching moving companies, she told me, getting quotes for packing and storage services. She'd found a charity that would pick up furniture donations, and she'd identified a consignment shop that might be interested in some of my better pieces. The efficiency was impressive, if somewhat premature. She was particularly excited about the timeline, explaining how everything could be coordinated to make the transition as smooth as possible. The apartment could be cleared out over a weekend, she said, with most of my belongings either donated or discarded. I'd only need to keep a few personal items. Since Sunset Manor provided all the basics, she made it sound like liberation rather than loss, freedom from the burden of maintaining my own household. Listening to her plan, the dismantling of my life, with such enthusiasm, was both heartbreaking and illuminating. This wasn't about my well-being or my happiness. This was about solving the problem of me, about removing the complications I represented from their carefully ordered world. The speed with which she was moving, the assumptions she was making, the decisions she was planning to implement without my input, all revealed the truth about how she saw me. I was an obstacle to be managed, not a person to be consulted. My preferences didn't matter, because she'd already decided what was best for everyone involved. The fact that I might have feelings about giving up my independence, about leaving the home I'd created, about surrendering control over my daily life, seemed irrelevant to her calculations. But as Jessica continued describing her plans, talking about donation pickups and moving schedules, I found myself thinking about the financial disclosure forms now sitting on Patricia's desk, about the numbers that would surprise everyone who'd made assumptions about my situation, about the choices I had that nobody knew about, the resources that could change everything about how this story unfolded. The call with Jessica ended with her promising to coordinate with Marcus about the logistics to make sure everything was handled efficiently and professionally. She assured me that I wouldn't need to worry about any of the details, that they would take care of everything. Her tone suggested she was doing me an enormous favor, managing responsibilities that would be too overwhelming for someone my age to handle. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, looking around at the home Jessica was so eager to help me abandon. Every room held memories, choices I'd made about how I wanted to live, small comforts I'd accumulated over the years, the morning light streaming through windows I'd positioned just right, the books arranged exactly how I liked them, the photographs that told the story of a life fully lived. This wasn't just a place to sleep and eat. It was the physical manifestation of my independence, my autonomy, my right to make decisions about my own existence. Jessica saw it as clutter and complication, but to me, it represented something much more fundamental: the right to choose my own surroundings, to wake up when I wanted, to eat what appealed to me, to spend my time according to my own preferences, rather than institutional schedules. That afternoon, I made another call to Margaret Chen, asking her to research something specific for me. I wanted information about Sunset Manor's ownership structure, their financial stability, their reputation in the industry. If I was going to play the game Jessica had started, I needed to understand all the players and all the rules. Margaret promised to have a complete report within 24 hours. The evening brought another family dinner invitation, this time to their house to discuss next steps and finalize plans. Jessica's voice carried that bright efficiency that meant she'd been making lists and checking off tasks, organizing my future with the same attention to detail she applied to planning dinner parties. She wanted to go over timelines, she said, to make sure we were all on the same page about how things would proceed. I accepted the invitation, knowing it would be my last performance as the grateful, compliant mother-in-law who appreciated their intervention in her life. Tomorrow, Margaret would have the information I needed about Sunset Manor. Patricia would have reviewed my financial disclosure and realized the magnitude of her miscalculation, and I would be ready to reveal just how wrong everyone had been about Dorothy Johnson. The game was about to change in ways Jessica couldn't possibly anticipate. She'd built her entire strategy on assumptions about my dependence, my gratitude, my willingness to accept their judgment about what was best for me. But she'd never considered the possibility that the woman she was trying to manage might have resources, options, and a will of her own. As I prepared for what I knew would be our final family meeting under the old rules, I thought about power dynamics and how quickly they could shift when someone stopped playing the role others had assigned them. Jessica had cast me as the helpless elderly widow who needed their guidance, but that character was about to exit the stage, replaced by someone who'd been there all along, waiting for the right moment to step into the spotlight. The woman who'd built a secure financial future with Charles, who'd made careful investments and smart decisions for decades, who'd chosen to live modestly, not out of necessity, but out of values that went deeper than material display. That woman was about to remind everyone that appearances could be deceiving, and that underestimating someone based on superficial observations was always a dangerous mistake. Tomorrow night's dinner would be Jessica's last chance to play the role of concerned daughter-in-law, managing her confused mother-in-law's affairs. After that, she'd have to confront the reality of who Dorothy Johnson actually was, and what she was actually capable of when pushed too far by people who mistook kindness for weakness. The reckoning was coming, and Jessica had orchestrated every detail of her own downfall without even realizing it. The dinner at Marcus and Jessica's house that evening was everything I'd expected and more. Jessica had prepared what she clearly considered an appropriate meal for someone about to enter institutional care. Simple foods that wouldn't challenge an elderly palate. The condescension was baked right into the menu, but I ate graciously, playing my part one final time. As we finished dessert, Jessica pulled out her folder of plans and timelines, spreading them across the table with the satisfaction of someone who'd solved a complex puzzle. Moving trucks scheduled for the following weekend, donation pickups arranged for Saturday morning, even a cleaning service booked to prepare my apartment for the next tenant. She'd thought of everything, except asking what I actually wanted. Marcus sat quietly through most of the presentation, occasionally nodding, but clearly uncomfortable with the speed at which everything was moving. When Jessica mentioned that Patricia from Sunset Manor had called to discuss my application, I saw my opportunity. I told them Patricia had been very interested in my financial disclosure, that there had been some surprises in my documentation that changed how they viewed my case. Jessica barely looked up from her charts, waving away my comment with the dismissive confidence of someone who thought she already knew everything important. She was too busy explaining the logistics of dismantling my life to pay attention to hints that her assumptions might be flawed. It was perfect. Really, her arrogance was about to become her downfall. The next morning brought the call I'd been waiting for. Patricia's voice was different this time. Professional, but with an underlying note of embarrassment. She needed to discuss my application in person, she said, preferably with my family present. There had been some significant developments that required immediate attention. When we arrived at Sunset Manor that afternoon, Patricia's entire demeanor had changed. She ushered us into a conference room I hadn't seen before, one clearly reserved for their most important discussions. The application materials were spread across a polished table, along with documents I recognized from Margaret's briefcase. Patricia began carefully, explaining that my financial disclosure had revealed some discrepancies with the information they'd received initially. As she walked through the numbers, I watched Jessica's face transform from confident satisfaction to growing confusion to something approaching horror. The modest pension recipient she'd described simply didn't exist. In her place sat a woman with assets that exceeded the annual operating budget of most care facilities. The silence that followed Patricia's presentation was deafening. Jessica stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language, unable to process how dramatically wrong her assumptions had been. Marcus looked between his wife and me with dawning understanding of what this meant for all their carefully laid plans. Patricia, meanwhile, was practically glowing with professional enthusiasm as she explained the premium services available to someone with my resources: private suites with full kitchens, personal care coordinators, access to exclusive amenities that most residents could only dream of. She apologized profusely for the earlier miscommunication, assuring me that someone of my standing would receive the kind of attention befitting a valued client. But here's the thing about having options that other people don't know about. You get to choose when and how to use them. I listened to Patricia's revised presentation with polite interest, asking thoughtful questions about services and amenities, allowing Jessica to believe that I was simply considering a more expensive version of her plan. Then I thanked Patricia for her time and explained that I decided not to pursue residency at Sunset Manor. After all, the shock on Jessica's face was worth every moment of discomfort I'd endured during their intervention. She'd worked so hard to arrange my institutional care, had invested so much energy in solving the problem of me, and now I was calmly declining to cooperate with her solution. Over the following weeks, I watched their financial situation unravel with the same methodical attention Jessica had applied to planning my displacement. The deposit they'd put down at Sunset Manor was non-refundable. The moving services they'd booked required cancellation fees. The charity pickup they'd arranged needed to be called off, but not before Jessica had already promised my furniture to friends who'd expressed interest in specific pieces. More importantly, they'd been counting on accessing my apartment's equity, on redirecting my monthly expenses toward their own financial pressures. Without my cooperation in their plan, they were left with the same money problems they'd started with, only now complicated by the costs they'd incurred trying to manage my affairs. Marcus finally found his voice about a month later, calling to apologize for how things had been handled. He admitted they'd been struggling financially, that Jessica had convinced him I'd be better off with professional care. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd realized he'd almost destroyed his relationship with his only remaining parent for the sake of his wife's pride and their temporary convenience. I forgave him, of course, because that's what mothers do. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it certainly doesn't mean pretending that nothing had changed between us. Trust, once broken by assumptions and manipulations, takes time to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all. As for Jessica, she never did apologize directly. Instead, she simply stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped including me in family plans. In her mind, I suppose, I'd betrayed her by refusing to be the helpless widow she needed me to be. My independence had become an inconvenience she couldn't solve, so she chose to pretend it didn't exist. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to isolate me from my own life, Jessica had succeeded only in isolating herself from mine. She'd wanted to manage me, to control my choices, to make decisions about my future without my input. Instead, she'd revealed exactly who she was and what she valued, information that proved far more useful than anything she'd learned about me. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't getting revenge on people who've wronged you. Sometimes it's simply refusing to be diminished by their expectations, to let their limitations become your limitations. Jessica had seen an elderly widow and assumed dependency. She'd looked at my modest lifestyle and concluded poverty. She'd mistaken my grief for confusion and my kindness for weakness. But assumptions, as I'd learned, have a way of revealing more about the people making them than about their intended targets. And sometimes, the best response to being underestimated is simply to let people discover just how wrong they've been, in their own time, in their own way, with consequences they've created for themselves. Today, I still live in my apartment, still make my own choices about how to spend my time and money. I've resumed dining at Chez Laurent, have taken up painting again, have reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during my period of playing the role others expected of me. I'm living the life Charles and I planned for, the one our careful financial preparation made possible. And Jessica, well, she's still struggling with the same problems she tried to solve by managing mine, still learning that you can't build lasting security by diminishing other people's autonomy. Some lessons, it seems, have to be learned the hard way, through consequences that teach what kindness and respect never could. The truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully people try to manage it. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply live authentically, make your own choices, and let others deal with the reality of who you actually are, rather than who they assumed you to be.